Covehithe on the Suffolk coast, and where I'm standing was, until several centuries ago, a good mile from the sea, but now I'm standing on a cliff top, and even that's not going to be here for very much longer. Today we're going to be exploring this part of the coast as we walk south towards Dunwich. East Anglia is famous for its great churches built towards the end of the medieval period by merchant wealth. The Suffolk coast has more than its fair share of them, and one of them is St Andrew Covehithe, which stands behind me. But as you can see, today it's a ruin. Covehithe Church was rebuilt on a grand scale towards the end of the 15th century, with aisles and clerestories fitting for the liturgy and worship of the late medieval Catholic Church. But then the Reformation intervened, and by 1672, the population of this small parish decided that the church was simply too big for them, and so they took it down apart from the walls and rebuilt a smaller church inside the ruins. And so James Gilbert and Enoch Girling, the church wardens, put out the contract for the building of this little church within the ruin at the end of the 17th century. But they brought the font from the old church with them, and in this small space it's rather imposing. We've come 3 miles down the coast to Southwold, which, as you can see, is a much busier place than Covehithe. It's become quite fashionable as a resort over the last few years. It's home to the Adnams Brewery. George Orwell lived here and wrote some of his books here, and it's also got one of those grand late medieval Suffolk churches. And this is the great church of St Edmund Southwold. Most unusually, it was built all in one long single campaign through the second half of the 15th century, with flushwork decorations, clerestories and aisles. It's just about perfect, like a great ship floating languidly at ease. Southwold is one of England's great late medieval urban churches, and the jewel in its crown is its set of 3 screens that run right across the church. They're beautifully painted with panels of saints and angels, but the strange thing about them is that they don't really fit. Southwold has 3 medieval screens, and this is the north aisle screen, and it's painted with the orders of angels, probably by the same artist as the church at Barton Turf in Norfolk. Now, the odd thing about these 3 screens is they're not quite the right size for the spaces they're in, and it is possible they weren't originally in this church at all. Just to the north of here was another grand church at Easton Bavants, which was lost to erosion from the sea towards the end of the 17th century. And just to the south of Southwold was the town of Dunwich, and Dunwich had 9 medieval churches, which have now all been lost to the sea. So could these screens have come from one of those churches? We've wandered a few miles up the River Blythe from Southwold. This is Blythburgh, and the church here was also rebuilt on a grand scale towards the end of the Middle Ages, but they didn't get around to replacing the tower before the Reformation intervened. I think this is probably my favourite church in all East Anglia. Let's go inside and take a look. This great church was rebuilt in the second half of the 15th century on a grand scale with aisles and clerestories for the liturgy and devotions of the late medieval Catholic Church. But after the Reformation, it was much too large for its small parish, and it fell on hard times. As we see it today, it's largely a result of the neglect it suffered. In the 17th century, the church nave was used for stabling horses, and it wasn't until the very end of the 19th century that there were plans put in place to restore Blythburgh Church. There was a certain amount of controversy because they wanted to replace all the furnishings and the roof. The Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings stepped in, and the result was that it was kept pretty much as it had been, made good, but not over-restored. Among the medieval survivals at Blythburgh, thanks to the intervention of the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings, are some remarkable bench ends. There are several sequences of them. There's the 7 Works of Mercy, the 7 Deadly Sins, and the 12 Labours of the Months. Among them, this woman, now headless, who's cutting a sheaf of corn. Blythburgh is one of those churches with a little of everything. And yet it's more than that. It's about the white light that floods in from the marshlands, falling over old woodwork, brick and stone. And about the angels that seem to be descending from the wide East Anglian sky. And so we've reached Dunwich, the end of our journey. And there's not much to Dunwich today, but in the past it was a great international port. By the end of the 12th century, there were perhaps 3,000 people living here. Dunwich had 9 churches, and in East Anglia, only Norwich, Ipswich and Cambridge had more. It was also the home of religious foundations, and I'm sitting in the ruins of one of them, a Franciscan friary. It's true that the sea did cause problems for Dunwich, but because the trade was so wealthy, it was a town worth defending. However, something terrible was about to happen. On the night of the 14th of January, 1328, a great storm threw a shingle bank across the mouth of the harbour at Dunwich. All the shipping moved up the coast to Walberswick, and from now on the town really wasn't worth defending. One by one, the churches went over the cliff. By the time that the iconoclast William Dowsing visited in 1644, there were just 2 of them left, and the last of them, All Saints, lost its tower as recently as 1919. There's not much left of Dunwich now, compared with what lies out there under the Great North Sea.